And the room magically goes quiet. Thank you. So we resume. And we will, in the second half, continue in part with the text, but both listen to and look at music, and in that begin to engage, I hope, a conversation. It's much more open-ended. But I want to begin by looking at the contents of the Rore print, the 1542 Madrigali. This table follows Jessie Ann Owens. Those of you who work in this literature will know that this particular print has been cited over and over and over and over again. As Bernhard Meyer identified, the first 17 madrigals follow the order of the 8 modes, and you can see that in the mode table. Although the impetus for such ordering may have come from the printer, Girolamo Scotto, who printed the volume, the absence of modal ordering in subsequent publications of these motets, that is, when the Rore motets were reprinted both by Scotto and Gardano, the Rore madrigals reprinted by both Gardano and Scotto, lacked the absence of modal ordering, suggesting that the arrangement might have come from the composer himself. Rore's collection, along with such later publications as the Zulato motet anthologies and a number of works by Lasso and Palestrina, provided the principal evidence by which Harold Powers articulated his theory of tonal types, which has been discussed quite frequently. While tonal types may serve as a compositional means of representing or an editorial means of classifying mode, they need not do so. Powers attempted a clear distinction between those polyphonic works which were intentionally written, quote, in the modes, and those which may be assigned to the modes after the fact. Powers was able to summarize the plan of Rore's 20 madrigals on this basis, and you see that in the right-hand column of this table following Owens with the type and the classifications by tonal type. Powers' position was in sharp contradistinction to one that relies on melodic features, articulation of species, and the characteristic use of melodic patterns as modal determinants, features outlined to a greater or lesser degree in chant theory and applied by analogy to the individual voices of a polyphonic complex. This latter stance was articulated most extensively in recent years, as I said earlier, in Bernhard Meyer's work. Meyer posited modality as an inherent, internal property of 16th century polyphony. Thus, by definition, Meyer's definition, all music from the period is in the modes. And he argued for an expressive theory derived from theoretical statements about melodic features of modes and modal ethos, as well as empirical observation from this basis of a wide range of repertory. It's worth noting that Meyer's introductions to these particular madrigals in his edition of the Opera Omnia, and I'd like to note those in extenso for the overview it provides for the collection, but especially for the clear sense of the argument made for approaching these works. And I'm in the text you have a very long quotation from the introduction. I'm going to take certain fragments of that. Distinctive features of the imitative fragments, together with characteristic cadential progressions, determine the tonality of each work to a degree which enables the experienced listener to distinguish the authentic form from the plagal. So the first emphasis there is on Meyer's sense of the experienced listener, which was a trope of theoretical writing in the US and Germany, particularly in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The experienced listener to distinguish the authentic form from the plagal modes. And this distinction, supported not only by countless theoretical treatises, but also by the cyclical plan discernible in many compositions, remained valid at least until 1600 or thereabouts in the case of more highly organized polyphonic works. So this was Meyer on the Rore. And then this was the place where Meyer reinforced his identification. Meyer was the first, I believe, to recognize that this was a modally ordered collection. And this is Meyer's introduction to the edition. The basic importance of the traditional tonal system is, and when Meyer says traditional tonal system, he means modes. The German Tonarten, die Tonarten. The basic importance of the traditional tonal system is readily apparent in Rore's own madrigal book of the year 1542, wherein the 8 modes are systematically adhered to without exception, namely numbers 1 to 3, tonus primus transpositus. Notice that Meyer always creates his own Latinates form for modal theory, regardless of what language the source was in. So in the sort of unified theory coming from Meyer, there is a notion of cadences, all put in and always in Latin. So number 1 to 3 are in the first tone transposed, number 4 and 5, the second tone transposed, meaning that they've been moved by the signature, number 6 to 8, tone 3, number 9, tone 4, number 10, 11, tone 5, number 12, 13, tone 6, number 14, 15, tone 7, 16, 17, tone 8. The madrigals 18 to 20 are not an integral part of the above-mentioned corpus and are apparently a foreign body incorporated after the original had been submitted for printing. Nevertheless, even these additional madrigals are also tonally systematic rather than arbitrary, in that they may be delegated to tone 1 transposed, whose final cadence deviates from the tonal order due to textual considerations, tone 2 transposed, and tone 3. So again, from Meyer, you have a careful part of the articulation of his theory that deviations tended to be explained by allusion to the text. But they were classed as deviations, and there was a whole notion of what deviation was. And finally, in what I think is the capsule notion of how Meyer approached these works, a knowledge of the theoretical rules prevalent in the 16th century enables the reader not only to understand Rore's use of tonality on the whole, but also explains those instances where ratione verborum, right, again, a Latin explanation for the resource to the text, the composer departs from the norm. Anomalies of tonality, clausulae peregrinae, commixtio tonorum are almost invariably motivated by textual anomalies, i.e. by words which connote deviation, change, contempt, ignorance, etc., or by words with a highly emotive connotation, dolor, amor, which cause the composer to employ the clausula in me in those modes in which such a cadence would ordinarily be inappropriate. It is, and then Aron goes on in the longer statement you have to talk about the notion of the exordia of the composition, of the repercussa, all of which are ways of understanding for the experienced listener as well as the experienced reader the mode of these. He finishes with the notion of historical authenticity in the case of Rore's madrigals. So now we have a turn to historical authenticity. Is neither to be sought in pedantic avoidance of accidentals, nor in the over-academic style of performance and adducing other theories. So to just pull back momentarily from that, back to this overview of the print, again to those modes, you see Meyer as the first to recognize in this print from that view that he described, from that view of the experienced listener, to the way in which this cycle had been ordered. Pache, Meyer, and Powers, I would say, the difficulty lies in ascertaining the distinction between those prints in which the process was one of a posteriori classification, i.e. a means of organizing the printed publication, and those in which modal theory played a generative role. That is this print ordered by the publisher a posteriori, Meyer then recognizing it, or does it reflect a priori composition on Rore's part? Apparently, in this Rore print, the arguments that one can make is that it came from the composer, and I'll elaborate some of that, but the argument is really Professor Owens's. The distinction may reside, in part, in the nature of the printed collection, between anthologies, where the ordering was clearly at the behest of the publisher, and the increasingly popular individual print, in which there was at least the possibility that the composer might exert a degree of control over the order in which his works were presented, at least in the first printing, because as it was anybody's game when the works were reprinted. And related to that are large-scale textual cycles in which mode provided a compositional means of overarching, if abstract, musical organization. So the argument that goes here begins that not only are these modally ordered, but that there is the potential, which Professor Owens again is the one who has argued, that Rohrer was actually trying to set a large-scale group of texts using mode as an organizing feature of those texts, which were chosen, put in order as the single feature one had. A number, and we'll return to this print in a moment. I want to contrast it with the Zarlino. A number of single composer editions from the 1540s reflected the impetus toward modal ordering. Gabriele Martinego's 1544 Madrigali for four voices stated on the title page that he had composed and arranged his madrigals according to their modal order. What the word compose there means is also open to question, whether he composed in the sense of putting them in order for the print, or he composed in the sense of musical composition is still a place of discussion. The specific attention drawn here to composing according to modal order highlights the important possibility, not just that individual compositions were in the modes, but that modal composition, so to speak, made possible the structuring of large cycles of text. And this is a point to which I'll return. From the end of the decade, the 19 motets of Zarlino's first printed anthology, the Musica Quinque Vocal Moduli, 1549, published by Giordano, have been clearly grouped on the basis of signature and final. While such editorial decisions might reflect an interest in modal theory, more often they appear to be the result of pragmatic considerations on the part of the publishers, particularly obvious in the case of Giordano, rather than some interest in abstract theoretical speculation. So the Zarlino motets, you have one table in your paper. This one is slightly different, just less information. This is the contents of the 1549 print. And you see, looking at this print, what the textual sources are. And we'll come back to a number of ways these are ordered and how it relates to what the print is doing. I've spent some time on this. But to move to the signatures and the labels, these modal labels appear in the tenor part book, except in two cases they appear in the quintus part book. Those two that are handwritten in are written in by Zarlino. They appear to be in Zarlino's hand. So although the front of the print says nothing, on the right-hand column here, these are actually from the print. These are not later classifications. And from the tonal types, you see that they've been grouped as shown here. That is a pair of Dorian works with a flat signature. Why open with Dorian works with a flat signature? Veni Sancte Spiritus. I'm saying what's in my text, so I won't move. Veni Sancte Spiritus is the obvious invocation for this print, which is dedicated to Santo Spirito and Isola. So you open with Veni Sancte Spiritus. It's also a standard way of opening it. The Pater Noster, which finishes this print, is Zarlino's largest work. It also ends his 1566 print. I'm not in the text now, I'm just talking to the handout for you. And so that determines, starting with the flat signature and G final for Veni Sancte Spiritus. So the Dorian, Hypo-Ionian, Dorian, Ionian, Aeolian, Hypo-Phrygian, Phrygian, Hypo-Dorian. The Paternoster is not labeled. It would still be Hypo-Dorian. It's not labeled because it's a canon of 7 voices out of 4, and so the canon appears where the label would appear for it. So this print goes one step further than the Rore, containing the first known application of Glarian's dodecachoral system. In addition to Giordano's grouping of motets in the print by tonal type, the tenor, as I mentioned, and occasionally the quintus part book include printed modal attributions and handwritten insertions. As can be seen from the classifications, Zarlino has adopted Glarian's nomenclature, including the new Aeolian and Ionian modes. Yet, as I have shown elsewhere, Zarlino's encounter with and apparent acceptance of Glarian's theory sometime after the publication of the Dodecachordon in 1547, undermine the very premise of a compositional cycle I'll explain that he undertook. You'll also notice, I'll highlight here, in 1549, Zarlino is labeling these deliberately Dorian Hypoionu. By 1558, they're simply numbered 1 to 12. These names no longer appear associated even with compositions from this print, which Zarlino highlights only 8 years later, but those 8 years seem to be crucial in what happens. And he seems to have undermined what's within this cycle, what I've argued is the largest scale compositional endeavor Zarlino has ever known to have undertaken, which was a modally ordered setting of the Canticum Canticorum that's partially dispersed in this printed collection. So you saw that there were Song of Songs tests, Canticum Canticorum, taking from, on this table that you have, taking from this print and others, it's able to reconstruct. I was able to reconstruct that Zarlino had undertaken an 8-mode setting of the 8 chapters of the Song of Songs, with 4 motets, 3 from this print and 1 other, as chapter 1, all with the same tonal type, with 2 motets and a missing one that would be chapter 2, a set of 3 motets that are all of chapter 3, chapter 4, there's not a setting, chapter 5, and then he seems to have quit. Again, outside the written text you have, I'll just give you a little context for those who understandably may not be familiar with this. I was able to show that Zarlino was following a particular text of the Song of Songs by Isidoro Chiari from 1544, following it word for word, dividing by chapters, visually according to that, and quite clearly intent on setting what was an ordered modal cycle in 8 modes, not 12, that moves all the way through the text. And if ever there were composition in the modes, this represents composition in the modes. The modes were the ordering feature for this set for Zarlino. Zarlino appears to have used parts of this cycle completely shorn from their original purpose when he publishes them in 1549. Obviously, in this instance, the dodecachordal labels represent categorization, Zarlino's own categorization of his own pre-existing 8-mode repertory, at least some of which was composed presumably within a different theoretical framework. Without that knowledge of a hidden, unknown 8-mode cycle, Benito Rivera and others used what were clearly a posteriori classifications, presumably by Zarlino, of a priori compositional practices operating under a different set of premises to posit, a la Bernhard Meyer, the modal composition of these works, of all of the works in 1549, using the later 12-mode duos that we heard the first one of as an analytical framework. I'll pause and highlight that for a moment, because absent the knowledge that Zarlino had ever composed an 8-mode cycle, he had so disguised it in 1549 that it seems absolutely reasonable when he cites these works in 1558 alongside the duos to think that the 1558 book, the Istituzione, it offers explanatory relevance for 1549. But they are not a 12-mode cycle, they're an 8-mode cycle composed that were undermined in 2 ways. The text, Chiari's text, ended up on the index, so not such a useful text to be using as a basis. And the modal theory was undermined by Glorianus in 1547. So Zarlino has recast the work. These 2 prints, the Rore print and the Zarlino print, I would argue, get at the heart of the matter for us. They share much in common, most notably that they've both been slow to reveal their secrets to modern users. Both show evidence of being special prints in terms of the care given to their production. Both hide their modal aspects. There's a simple alphabetic order table of contents for each of them. Sorry, I breathe. So the table of contents reveal nothing about the specialness of any orders held within these prints. Both seem to contain larger scale modal cycles as well as additional pieces. Both raise questions of whether the composer or the printer was responsible for ordering the text, or whether the two worked in some sort of collaboration, or whether in both cases there were other collaborators. Whether Rore had a collaborator on putting together his Italian text, whether Zarlino was working secondhand from Chiari, or whether he had some commission that drew him to those texts. Both have been adduced as examples of tonal types that represent modal categories, but both have been shown to contain textually ordered works that would seem to point to modal cycles, a kind of long-form composition in which mode provides the organizing feature. One, Rore's, appears to use mode not merely for ordering, but affectively, while the other, Zarlino's, seems to deliberately eschew modal affect. By that comment by Zarlino, I mean that if you arbitrarily set a single chapter of text all in a certain mode and the next single chapter of text all in a certain mode, the idea that there's any affective resonance related to those texts is a hard one to sustain because of the pre-existing grouping of the text. Both, it seems, are the works of composers who were following in the footsteps of Adriano Villert. In some ways, he appears to be the voice that is most absent in this discussion. That is, if we think about who Rore and Zarlino both apparently encountered in some way in the 1540s in Venice, and who is propagated in their works, and Rore's publications from the there are interesting questions with those. That I would pose at this moment is the absent voice in the discussion I'm presenting you. Daniele has obviously talked about affect in some of Rore's works. Catalina Schultz has worked on it, but I think there may be yet more connections to think about in some of these prints as we understand it. These Rore and Zarlino prints offer us much for contemplation, sitting as they were at the very crosshairs of very different impulses in the 1540s that developed their own afterlives, even as they laid the foundation for subsequent composition and theorizing. Much of the modern controversy has surrounded modern interpretations of modal theory of the Renaissance and has been generated by the potential that mode holds for the analysis of Renaissance polyphony. The most thoroughgoing, persuasive attempt to demonstrate the relevance, as I've said earlier, of modal theory for Renaissance polyphony was undoubtedly Bernhard Meyer's, I'll return again to it, The Modes of Classical Vocal Polyphony. The heart of Meyer's work rested in an attempt to study the theoretical sources for polyphonic modality and apply them to a discussion of music. One cannot but be impressed by his vast knowledge of both repertory and theoretical sources. Enlightening and influential though Meyer's work was, it has nevertheless been subjected to fierce criticism. On the one hand, the modes represented the culmination of an ongoing polemic with Karl Dahlhaus that centered on the recognition of authentic and plagal modes in polyphony. While Dahlhaus argued for the convergence of complementary modal pairs as Gesamtmodi, Meyer attempted to demonstrate the distinction of authentic and plagal modes in polyphony. On the other hand, Meyer often used sources in what appears to be an almost uncritical manner, ever ready to attach expressive interpretation to his understanding of modal theory. While a number of articles followed Meyer's lead, a series of increasingly skeptical articles by Powers attempted to demonstrate the artificiality of the modal-tonal dichotomy enshrined in this debate. Both Myers and Powers were essentially empiricists in their own ways, although starting from very different points of departure, which Powers described through the anthropological lens of emic and etic. That such diversity of understanding should hold sway is hardly surprising in light of the extraordinary wealth of opinion shaping the concept of mode for a cross-section of 16th century society that included, as I've said earlier, priests, schoolboys, singers, composers, theorists, music publishers, humanists, musical amateurs, patrons. Yet these sources may point us to a further reconsideration of what musical sources tell us about the theorist rather than the other way around, right? What musical sources tell us about the theorist, not necessarily what theorists tell us. So I would like to pull that in by reminding that connection that Zarlino highlights. This is a facsimile of the first of the Song of Songs, the Canticum Canticorum, motets Oscillator Me, and you'll see there the Dorian mode in the original print, next to Zarlino's theory on the mode. As always, Zarlino provides a helpful reminder of why a certain futility attaches to attempts to compartmentalize theory and practice. And I want to give him, in some ways, the last theoretical word before we turn to that practice, with two quotes from the Istituzione. One, in which Zarlino says, interestingly, as a writer of a book, the musician cannot perfect himself solely by reading and rereading books. Ultimately, to understand the things I've been demonstrating and others to be shown, he must consult with a person skilled in counterpoint. This is an interesting statement to make within a book. He also goes on, theory without practice, as I've said before, is of small value, since music does not consist only of theory and is imperfect without practice. This is obvious enough. Yet some theorists, treating of certain musical matters, without having a good command of the actual practice, have spoken much nonsense and committed 1,000 errors. On the other hand, some who have relied only on practice without knowing the reasons behind it have unwittingly perpetrated thousands upon thousands of idiocies in their compositions. So for the final word on that session, I want to turn to a less formal discussion of two of the Mode 1 works. I took the duo from Mode 1 from each of these prints to understand their intersections with concerns of modal theory, their role in the context of a music print, and their role within a larger textually organized whole. And those two prints, those sets of works, and there are some scores circulating, we had some confusion, I apologize, are the opening two from the Rore book, which share the same tonal type. The very opening madrigal sometime may, the brevio, may act as a sort of overall arching introduction to the set. Professor Owens has argued with the Petrarch serving as the first in the cycle, but you'll notice they have the same clefing, same tonal type as they open that cycle. And then from Zarlino, the opening Veni Sancte Spiritus, the setting of the sequence, and also Oscillator Me, which is the first of the Song of Songs. So all of these classified as, or serving in a compositional place as Mode 1 within the cycles, but all posing questions, I think, if you bear in mind, and we may go back to it, the Zarlino duo, of the prescriptive duo of what Mode 1 should do from Zarlino himself. So I'd like, I'm going to start with the Zarlino actually, so we can end with the Rore, because musically that will be more satisfying for all of us. Oh, we have the Rore, so we'll start with the Rore. But let me just show you the prints, and we'll start with the, but we'll go to the Rore. It's fun, it's all good. Just as you, just to look for the it's perfect. Okay.
Ce n'è uno dei due, ma non per risparmiare la carta, perché la macchina che sta lentissima. Facciamo fare anche le altre, così avete il materiale completo. Questo qui ce l'hai.
It's funny. I know these pieces. I have it online. So,
where is the musica chordal attribution?
So in
the part?
it's in the tenor part.
In the tenor.
And I've shown you the superiors
Just in the
here.
tenor.
Just in the tenor, except in two, it's in the quintus, which has the same range as the tenor. And those two seem to be because they actually in the print were flopped between what was named tenor or quintus. and it's a good opening. So the Veni Sancte Spiritus, the reason I did the facsimile for you of the Superius, and I'm sorry, the score you've got now has a few of my marks on it. We had confusion in a PDF or not, so you can ignore those. But they just tell you where the text starts. For the Veni Sancte Spiritus, the opening motet of the collection, it's the second longest motet of Zarlino's that are known. It's 5-voice motet. But it's a paraphrase of the plain song in the Superiors, primarily. And the reason I showed you the facsimile for the Superiors is because you can see in that, as he opens unusually. He doesn't open with the sort of known or usual, whether this was Zarlino's chant or whether it was an alteration. But what you see is then he immediately makes obvious, if I have a cursor, here, and then the parallel text as it begins here, right, so that he does it's a variation chain, right, of pairing 1 and 2. He divides the text exactly in the middle, the 10 strophes of the, this is the first half of the text, so he's pairing in 2s, and likewise for the second half of the text. So for Zarlino, whatever we might hear and look at, for Zarlino, the fact that there is a mode 1 chant would identify this as mode 1 without any further anything. If it's a mode 1 chant for Zarlino, it is in and of mode 1. What we will also see, and I'll play the prima pars for you. I was very fortunate in editing both these works from 1549 and then the 1566 to have the good fortune for this recording by Ensemble Pluiltre, who recorded the Veni Sancte Spiritus, all of the Canticum Canticorum, and then the Pater Noster. So they did a miniature version of the print with the framing. This is their recording. But what you will hear are the frequent and unsurprising cadences, for example, to G, as expected, that are built into the paraphrase of the chant. So again, the quite old-fashioned technique of this piece, in a way. So this is Zarlino, the composer. So I will play, I hope for you, the prima pars. It may be, for many of you, the first time to hear a Zarlino composition. Bear in mind the duo that you heard and the clarity of the duo and where that was. And now this is Zarlino's first mode 1 piece from the 1549 print. So I won't play the Secunda pars for you. That's the prima pars of Zarlino's Venezante Spiritus. To go back to Massimo's point, and to highlight that, the attributions in this book, even though they are 12-mode attributions, are placed in the tenor part book. That notion still in places of the tenor or the voice in that range as being the place that for Zarlino in a collection he identified the mode, so no other voices carried that attribution. A few quick observations I will make, but I will happily entertain those from others of you who have heard this. You will have noticed that it follows the chant quite exactly in terms of where it cadences. That chant conveniently cadences primarily on what Zarlino would call the final or the first of the mode and the fifth. Ensemble plus ultra, when singing this, the reason they chose to sing it at essentially at pitch, quite high, given the transposition, is because they sang the D the works on D with no transposition immediately after on the recording, and so there was a decision to maintain that distinction of sounds. That was the great thing of working with them in the recording, of saying those tonal types seem to mean differently. Had they taken it on themselves, I think they would have pulled it down about a third to feel like where they were singing this chant. So it's a very straightforward setting of a chant work that has a pre-existing mode one with obvious cadences and obvious places that are observed. So if we looked back to this for modal classification, I think there would be little difficulty. I don't know if that is something shared for the room, that it's obvious. If you have a mode one chant that's being paraphrased, that's setting up all of the major points of articulation, presumably the polyphony is mode one. But Zarlino here has labeled it as Dorian, right, in the Glorianus' notion of mode one, and then in the treatise it comes back to being mode one in a 12-mode context. For mode one, that maybe doesn't matter, but for other works that are in different modes, such as mode 5, becomes Ionian in the print, becomes mode 11 in the treatise. And so what does that mean? But the other piece of Zarlino that I want to highlight for us is a very different composition. And here you see the attribution in the tenor part, the Dorian mode attribution. You also, and I believe you have the score too for this. So in the same print, but this is a oscillator me oscilis, or sui, yes? It occurs in the print in the second group of Dorian works.
C'è dopo, l'avete trovato? Sempre in Zarlino, dopo le due tecniche
Oh, so it's not in the end of the Zarlino?
No.
So you can follow the facsimile too, and I can put up a score if we need to. Because actually the point here will be an oral rather than a visual point, so it's fine, right, if you don't have the scores.
No, but we have the score.
Jesse, it's on the reverse side, I think.
Oh, okay. Okay.
There always has to be some confusion. So, and I apologize you don't have text here. Also Dorian mode as labeled, but this was the opening of an 8-mode cycle, an undeniable 8-mode cycle, and this was the first piece of that cycle. So Venezante Spiritus opens the book, but Oscillator Me opens a cycle of newly set text with no, although there are plenty of antiphons Zarlino could have referred to, he was setting continuously the biblical text. So Oscillatory, a very, Song of Songs, a very effusive text. And what happens in this cycle, to give you the opening, this is the first piece. All four of the mode 1 pieces, the prima pars ends with the same sonority as here, the secunda pars in the same sonority. So throughout each of these there are sounds that become the reference. This is in the D mode 1, like the duo. So think about the duo we heard. Think about the recorder, the simple 2-part duo. Listen to this piece with that duo in mind and ask how one relates to the other. So we finish in the middle, we would come back at the end to the final and the secunda pars. This is undeniably a motet that Zarlino composed in mode 1, to represent mode 1. Sometime after 1544 and sometime before 1549. That much is certain. Probably sometime before 1547, although it's not clear how he encountered Florianus's theory or in what form that he moved to these modes. My own observation to you is that one is hard-pressed to fully map the theory of those duos back onto this work in terms of the expectation for cadences, for the regularity, for the nature of imitation, for melodic formulas. So that the notion of composing in the modes for Zarlino here seems much more akin to what happens with the notion of a tonal type and the tonal space and what happens with finals, where he must begin and end, but where he goes in the middle is hardly marked with what we would call a cadence. There is at work here something else going on as you look at the tenor part, which is up for you, or you look through the other parts. Every singer has all of the text for every one of these pieces. Every singer sings every word of all of the text all the way through for the whole of the setting, which seems to be about a singer reading and singing a text that comes together. that changes very much with what happens in later and other compositions where voices are left out. So that notion too, in the same book before, of the text and Zarlino's understanding of what clarity of text means, one would not point to this for clarity of text, except the text is extraordinarily clear individually. Collectively, not so. So that points to a different way of reading and evolution, I would argue, about how Zarlino thinks about in the modes. But I'm happy to take comments or questions on these pieces before we turn to the Rore pieces, or we can come back to them as well. Great.
Here's how I would summarize it. I want to see if it goes with your thinking. To me, especially since you've been stressing the chronology, Zarlino's standard of modal composition or technique is evolving. It's becoming more musically detailed. I'm not sure what I mean by that, except that in those duos, you can look at intervals or characteristic shapes in the melody. Here, less so. And in I guess composition, the example that's on a mode 1 chant, therefore mode 1, I was at C in that example because I'm used to very carefully crafted 17th century examples. So it seems that Zarlino is.
So I would amplify that point, and it's the bigger point I'm trying to make with these examples, that somewhere in the late 1530s and early 1540s, composers are really both experimenting with mode, but also using mode in a much larger scale way. So this is only one part of one piece that is 4 pieces that are all making mode 1. And so over those 4 pieces, what one hears over and over are certain sonorities repeated. And so for Zarlino, in 1545, let's pick a year, but somewhere in that mid-1540s, to set a much longer text, all 8 books of the Song of Songs, he has to have some organizing principle because there's no pre-existing melody. And he has to have some unifying principle. And mode in an abstract way becomes that principle. So these motets literally move up the scala. Chapter 1 is in mode 1. Chapter 2 is in mode 2. Chapter 3 is in mode 3. In a theology that for the Casanese, whose text he's using, was a theology of illumination and of ascent, right? So I actually think it was taking a quite abstract view of mode, and using that abstract view of mode of saying, now if I share final and tonal type, I can put them together and this group will sound continuous for chapter 1. And they truly do, because it's a wash of sound with the same, the prima pars ends on an A sonority, the secunda pars ends on the D sonority, not just the same sonority, distributed the same way in the voices. Literally the same sound as a pillar that comes back to end each of these. And then the next one starts and it moves to the transposed into a different tonal sound in the same pillars. So there's an abstract notion of mode, I would argue, that is not so much melodic, not so much intervening cadences, but how to group works. And clearly for Zarlino, not affective, I would argue. Jesse and I may argue back and forth, because these texts change radically over the course of this chapter, and yet they're all mode 1. So if you take Delago saying how a composer thinks about choosing texts and trying to set them, Zarlino here is choosing a much longer, it's a huge project if he had finished it. And maybe it's a project of somebody who was outside the norm. But I think that he's trying to find a way to organize text, and mode serves as it, in a very abstract and general way. And by the time, your point, by the time he comes to 1558, coming out of the counterpoint book, coming out of not only his experiments, but the Rore we'll look at, the Villers, all of this stuff happening in Venice, he's able to make a much more codified, prescriptive theory that says not only can you do these abstract things, but here is how, if you want to really hear and recognize the mode in terms of points of imitation, in terms of cadences, all these things put together. But remember, the music it's a long answer, I'm sorry. The music he's citing is music like this, right? If you actually look to all the music he's citing, it's Josquin, it's Villers, and it's even Zarlino's own pieces, most of which predated the Istituzione. So there he's like Aaron. He's looking back to a repertory and saying, with these sets of rules, what categories can I put it in? And I think it is a very broad-based way that one could categorize it, and they do align with tonal types. But then he's looking forward and saying, as you're composing, as you think about the soggetto, as you think about the ways you can imitate, as you think about time, as you think about all this big book 3 I've written, and this is what you know about the modes, here's what it would look like. Here's what free composition going forward would look like. The other thing for Zarlino, most of the text, half of the motet text, in some ways invoke a pre-existing melody and a pre-existing chant. And so in that motet repertory, I do think there's that fallback that says, even though I may be lost in this, everybody knows Veni Sancte Spiritus. Everybody knows that's a mode 1 chant. Everybody knows where that sound. And whatever happens to that sound in polyphony can't unmake that it is mode 1. It can't be, and in that sense I would actually follow Meyer. It's inherent that if you take a chant that is so known to be in this mode, the polyphony is in some way going to encompass that. Jesse?
Yeah, I agree, by the way, with you that he's not using affect, and the I think there are 8 chapters in the song.
Yeah. No,
So
some exact
this
math.
is that number 8 is a wonderful number and suggests the modes. When theorists like Delago and Baneo talk about affect and ethos, more often than not, they're borrowing from Greek writers and are internally inconsistent. These lists are ridiculous,
Yeah.
and you're perfectly right to ignore them for this paper. So,
But they come back. Yeah.
We can ask students
Yes.
now. If,
Yes.
Penso che con questi ascolti che abbiamo fatto potete reagire anche sulla dimensione emozionale di quello che avete sentito, no?
Yeah.
They can react to
Yes.
the emotional experience. Che impressione avete avuto? So che è difficile intervenire così, ma
I think the first point is to distinguish maybe between what is theorizes and the didactic method, which is music. A composer, one write music is free sometimes from rules. One he needs to teach, to write a book, teach to the others. He needs to create some guide for the others. So we have to, sometimes it's difficult to compare that Vicinius that Zarlino wrote to the real music, because there is a big gap. Music composition technique go forward very far from sometimes some kind of theories.
And I think the gap is also in recognizing that Zarlino, as a composer in the 1540s, is also finding a certain kind of compositional voice, with or without success at times, right? So the look back that people do to his music as though the music itself is prescriptive. What's the context in which we put Zarlino's motets in comparison with other motets? And it's a very, I think you make a good point, it's a very experimental moment in the 1540s for these composers. I think it's fair to say that that people are moving to new kinds of texts and new ways of doing it, and the theory treatise doesn't have to deal with any of that. In fact, couldn't. There's also with Zarlino, I think it's fair to say, it's a great wash of consonants. Great wash of consonants. That it's rarely punctuated. It's rarely articulated. It's not what one expects from what Zarlino writes as a theorist of how it should sound. He may be a better theorist than he is a composer, or a better composer than theorist. They don't have to agree with one another, but here they're in quite a different place. Shall we turn to Rore? Or, yeah. So now we move to a different world slightly earlier. You also have scores. One of the challenges is that as much cited as Rore's first book of madrigals are, and cited constantly, Meyer, Powers, over and over because it's the first modally ordered collection, there is no recording of this group of works as a whole. There are recordings of some of the works. There are recordings of selections, but because they are of three, they are the. But Professor Owens actually has a project with Blue Heron, right? That's it, Blue Heron, to do a recording of the whole book. It's coming, but in the absence of that, so because. In some ways the same as Zarlino's works from the 1540s, well, not Rore and Zarlino compositionally I may not put in the same realm, but in the same way that Zarlino's works were looked at by theorists, both contemporary and modern, Rore's early madrigals, this first book of madrigals, is cited all the time in the modern theoretical literature. But musically, it's the later Rore works that are privileged in the editorial and performing capacity. And so my interest in these is not so much in the individual works, but in what happens in this collection or group and thinking about what happens. I'll keep making gestures to Professor Owens, as she's pointed out. If you move from mode 1 to mode 8 in order, this is something that I feel like should be obvious to all of us, but she's the first one to say. In mode 1, it's a minor third above the final. Mode 1 and 2. Mode 3 and 4, minor third above the final. Mode 5 and 6, major third above the final. Mode 7 and 8, major third above the final. Inevitably, the sound of moving in a collection that truly is trying to move from mode 1 to mode 8 in a musical way as a musical whole, in the same way that the Zarlino I talked about ascending the scala will naturally move from a prevalence of a sound of minor thirds to a sound of major thirds over the course of the cycle. And so in these large scale 8-mode modal settings, there is a certain kind of turn of the sound that will happen that one's only aware of if you actually listen to the pieces consecutively as though they were a set. Individually, that is lost. So you have the score, and you have a facsimile here of the first of the madrigal that opens the set for Rore. It's a ballata by Brevio. And as Jesse has argued, is serving as the first stanza of this piece. Because we only have the score, I won't spend a lot of time. We'll listen to a recording and come back to this. But I think you do see immediately, even as you look at the cantus, that whose ever notion of modal definition one was looking at, if you were looking for melody or looking what happens with cadences throughout this, that there would be ways that one, I think, would see or think of it as aligning in mode 1. What becomes more interesting, of course, with a very different text and a very different genre, and this, it seems to me, is also the challenge for modal theory, the notion that madrigal composition and motet composition are going to be governed in a way by the same affective as well as musical and tonal properties is an interesting moment of intersection. So that in this opening Rore madrigal, you see real clarity of text setting, of affective moments. I'd like, without looking at it in too much detail, we'll come back to it, to actually take you to the second madrigal, which is a Petrarch setting, right? A Petrarch sonnet. This one is recorded, and as Greg pointed out, on YouTube as well as in regular. And so I'd like, you've still got Zarlino, the Zarlino Bacchini, the duos in your ears, the Zarlino motets in your ears, and the Zarlino Mode 1 motets, Rore Mode 1 madrigal. That is Rore, one believes, actually writing in Mode 1 with a deliberate intent.
Who are the performers?
No.